Hello, my name is Mary Martha Churchman. I'm with the Federal Transit Administration Office of Program Management. And today I'm going to be giving a high-level overview of FTA's statutory authority and the grant programs that we administer that provide assistance to state and local governments and a few other entities to provide public transportation service at the local level. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about the legislative authority for our programs. Federal assistance for public transportation was initiated by President John F. Kennedy in 1962 was the original proposal, and he proposed at that time that he thought that for the foreseeable future an investment of $10 to $25 million a year would be needed to maintain public transit in America. And his vision came to reality in the UMTA Act of 1964, was the Urban Mass Transportation Act that was passed in the year 1964. And the Department of Transportation didn't exist yet at that point in time, though it was envisioned. And so originally, the original grant programs for urban mass transportation were administered by the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and it was primarily an urban program. It was really focused on public transportation in large American cities. And it really was enacted in the wake of what had been happening in the 1950s and early 60s, that the privately operated public transit services that were the norm at that time were in financial trouble and were beginning to go out of business. And cities and local governments around the country were picking up some of those services on a public basis. And they were doing it with local funds for the most part, but the capital assets of those private operators had been allowed to deteriorate to such a state that there really needed an infusion of capital assistance to bring them back up to a state of good repair, which is interesting because right now in the year 2012, the state of good repair is very much an emphasis and focus of federal assistance. And initially, all of those programs enacted back in 1964, and there were only one or two programs, were all capital programs. They were all focused on bringing the assets of the public transit systems up to a state of good repair where they could operate. And so, starting in 1964, UMTA was authorized and capital assistance for public transportation began at the level of investment of approximately $10 million a year. And as you know, now we have about a $10 billion a year program, and we've got close to 20 different grant assistance programs. So things really have grown. The other thing I find interesting is we began in HUD with the Housing and Urban Development Department, and now once again, the Federal Transit Administration is working very closely with HUD in livability, sustainability initiatives, and so it's kind of come full circle. But even with the programs administered in HUD, the understanding was that when the Department of Transportation was stood up a few years later, the programs would move to the Department of Transportation, and that did indeed happen a few years later. So that was the original authorization for federal funding for public transportation. Typically, the big federal agencies and departments and grant programs of all kinds, not just transportation, have authorization laws that cover a 5 to 6 year period, I think probably 10 years at most, and they establish the ground rules for the programs. They established the estimated funding levels of the program over the authorization period. I've been working for the Department of Transportation for over 35 years, and I've seen a number of authorizations. I probably was at a junior staff level when I came in 1976. I wasn't very aware of the authorization, but I can remember in the 1980s there were several authorizations with S at the beginning of the word for surface transportation. There was the STA, the Surface Transportation Act, early in the 80s, and then there was STAA, and I can't remember what that stood for. And then there was, beginning in the early 90s, there was STURA, the STURA, the Surface Transportation and Uniform Relocation Act that dealt with real estate acquisition under these federal programs. But the programs were pretty stable during that period through the 80s and didn't change a whole lot, but they were reenacted, reauthorized periodically. And then in 1991, ICE-T was the first of the T authorizations. There was ICE-T, and then there was T21, and then there was Safety-Lou, the most recent authorization that we're still functioning under. And there was really there were a lot of major changes in ICE-T in terms of restructuring the program, in terms of establishing new planning requirements. But the big innovation in ICE-T was guaranteed funding levels. So that for the first time, the funding levels that were established for each of the programs and authorization were followed pretty closely by Congress in the years of the authorization in terms of funding levels. They established it so that they were kind of set apart from the other general funds of the government so that there was a stable and reliable source of funding. And that was one of the really big innovations of ICE-T that has been maintained pretty much to this date and has really provided a lot of stability for public transit. Though through that period of the 90s into this century, the funding levels were steadily increasing up until the last few years when the authorization has ended. We've been on a series of extensions and funding has been flat in a period of relative austerity across government, and we've been at the $10 billion level for 3 years now. So at any rate, that's what happens in terms of reauthorizations. And at the end of each authorization, sometimes the next authorization isn't enacted quite in time, and as most of you are aware now, we are past the end of the original period of the Safety-Lou authorization. We've had a series of extensions. But the grant programs that I'm going to talk about in the rest of my presentation are the way things are now as of Safety-Lou, and I'll add the caveat that they could change with the next authorization. Some of the programs could be eliminated, new programs could be added, the rules could change, but I'm going to be talking about the way things are right now. Shortly after the enactment of ICE-T, all of the transit legislation was codified in the United States Code. So whereas before we always referred to the Urban Mass Transportation Act of 1964 as amended, and every time we got a new authorization it was just an amendment of that 1964 Act, it wasn't actually simultaneous with ICE-T, but shortly after, Congress decided, I guess we were around to stay at that point. The program was over 20 years old, and they decided it wasn't going away, so they put it into the United States Code. So most of our legislation is now in Title 49 of the United States Code at Chapter 53. And so from now, after that point, whenever we had a reauthorization, it amended 49 U.S.C. Chapter 53. So that's the authorized level, and it tells how much from the mass transit account of the Highway Trust Fund and how much in appropriated general funds from the U.S. Treasury were going to be available for the programs each year. And the balance between trust funds and general funds and which programs were funded out of which kind of money has changed several times over the years, and I'm not going to get too deeply into that. But each year in the appropriations cycle, in the annual appropriations bill, Congress enacts an obligation limitation for the parts of the programs that are funded out of the trust fund, the mass transit account of the Highway Trust Fund, and it actually appropriates money from the general funds of the Treasury. And the last few years have been a little chaotic with delayed appropriations and continuing resolutions continuing funding at the prior year levels. It hasn't always been predictable, but once Congress does enact the appropriations for the year, the Federal Transit Administration publishes a Federal Register notice that tells what the funding levels are in each of the programs and how much each area is entitled to under the formula programs. In addition to the programs that are in Chapter 53, there are some non-codified programs, sometimes a program that Congress doesn't envision necessarily as being a long-term program, it'll just enact in the authorization as kind of a freestanding authorization, or in some other act like the Defense Appropriations Act or some other act, or even in the Appropriations Act itself. So I'll talk about a few non-codified programs as well as the ones that are in our statute. So now, getting into the actual grant programs, and I won't spend as much time on every slide as I did on that first one to give the background. Basically, when we talk about the grant programs that we provide to state and local governments, we're talking about two different kinds of programs: formula grant programs and discretionary grant programs. Under a formula program, how much money a particular entity will receive is determined by a formula, either one that's established in the law or one that's created by FTA under authority that's given to us in the authorization. And so these are the ones where we're not making discretionary decisions that City X is going to get so much money and City Y is going to get a different amount of money. The factors for how the funds are distributed are spelled out in the law or in an administrative formula, and we just run the numbers once we get the appropriations from Congress. For the discretionary grant programs, somebody has the discretion to decide who gets what. In the past, we had a number of earmarks where Congress decided who was going to get how much money and for what purpose. For the last few years, Congress has stepped back from that practice of earmarking, and FTA, for the first time in a long time, has had a number of the discretionary programs where we've actually had the discretion to decide how to distribute the money. And so you've seen a number of notices of funding availability and opportunities to compete on a competitive basis based on the evaluation criteria and based on priorities established by the administration for those discretionary grants. In all of those programs, there's really three kinds of financial assistance that we provide for public transit. We provide funding for planning, we provide funding for capital, that's buying or maintaining things, vehicles, buildings, the kinds of items that you need to operate transit, or finally operating assistance. And as I go through the programs, I'll talk a little bit more about operating assistance, because not all sizes of areas, not all programs fund all of those categories of assistance. And then there's some other smaller sources of funding can be used for some kinds of administrative expenses and other things. But those are the three big categories of funding. And I guess the other overarching principle in our public assistance, that with a very few exceptions under some very specialized programs, all of the funding programs go to support public transportation. Sometimes we call it transit, but the definition of transit in the law excludes intercity bus and rail service, school bus service, charter and tour service, or exclusive taxi. So we're talking about shared ride services at a local or regional level that are open to the general public for the most part, or some specialized segment of the general public. And then here are the FTA grant programs as they exist at this point in time. And as you can see, we have a mix of formula programs and discretionary programs, and two special appropriations that I put down on the bottom of the formula program columns that aren't really formula programs, but it's a specific amount of money that's for a specific purpose in a specific area, so they're not really discretionary, so I put them on the formula side. But as you can see, we've got planning programs, we've got urbanized area, we've got some non-urbanized area, some programs that are targeted to a special purpose like maintenance and modernization of fixed guideway systems, some specialty programs like job access and reverse commute and new freedom. Got discretionary program to fund clean fuels, to fund buses and bus facilities, the new starts and small starts, and then some smaller specialty programs like tribal transit and transit in the parks and alternatives analysis, over-the-road bus, and I'll talk about all of these in a little more detail. The next slide, though, really gives you an idea of proportionality. the Urbanized Area Formula Program, the 5307 program, and all of these numbers that I'm throwing out, like 5307, 5310, 5311, are sections within 49 USC Chapter 53. The 53 shows you that it's in Chapter 53, and the last two digits tell you which section it is in the authorization. So the 5307 formula, which is the formula assistance to urbanized areas, cities over 50,000 as defined by the U.S. Census, is 41% of our FTA budget. And these are based on 20 numbers from fiscal year 2010, but really the percentages haven't changed much, if at all. So basically that's the workhorse of our program. That's the bread and butter program for public transit in urbanized areas. And you can see some of the programs are really, really tiny. The New Starts program and the rail modernization programs are the other big ones, and they're focused on urbanized areas too. So even though our name has changed to the Federal Transit Administration, in terms of the funding percentages, we're still very much an urban-focused agency. Though we'll talk about the rural program and tribal transit programs and some other programs that do support public transit in areas other than urbanized areas. So the planners have taught me well that whenever we talk about our grant programs, we should start with planning, because that's where things begin at the local level. So we have basically two big planning programs that are in Section 5303 and 5304, the Metropolitan Planning Program and the statewide planning programs. For both of these programs, we make grants only to the states. All of the money goes to the state DOTs, and in the case of the Metropolitan Planning Program, they pass the money through to the metropolitan planning organizations that are set up at the urbanized area level. Every city over 200,000 has an MPO, and I think the cities under 50,000, many of them have planning organizations too. I'm not sure if they're required to. The statewide planning funds go to the states also, and they can use it for planning for rural and for small urbanized areas, those cities under 200,000, or they can pass the money through to the MPOs to support metropolitan planning where the metropolitan planning funds aren't adequate for a specific planning study. The other thing to know about the planning grant programs is that the Federal Highways Administration also has a comparable planning program, and the purposes for which the highway planning funds and the transit planning funds can be used are totally interchangeable, so that they can use their highway planning funds to fund planning for transit and transit funds to fund planning for highways. And we have an agreement with the Federal Highway Administration where we can administer the grants as one grant with both highway and transit funds in it. In either Federal Highways can administer that grant, or the FTA can administer that grant, and that's really the state's call, however the state DOT wants it to be. Then looking at urbanized areas, there's really three core programs that support public transit in urbanized areas. One is the 5307 formula program that I mentioned, that's the biggest FTA grant program. The fixed Guideway modernization program, which is also a formula program, and the New Starts program, including small starts, which again is for new fixed guideway systems in urbanized areas. But those three programs taken together total 78% of the FTA program funds. So, and they're focused on our urbanized areas. Looking first at the Section 5307 Urbanized Area Formula Program, eligible recipients are public bodies. For large urbanized areas, it's a very complex formula that decides how much each area is going to get. For areas over 200,000 in population, as determined by the U.S. Census, the funds are apportioned directly to an urbanized area. Note they're not apportioned to a transit operator, to the transit authority. They're not apportioned to the MPO. They're actually apportioned to the urbanized area, and there might be multiple service providers within an urbanized area. There might even sometimes be multiple planning organizations. The law requires the urbanized area to designate a recipient of the funds along with, in accordance with the planning process, and the governor has to sign off on it. But they decide at the local level who's going to be the designated recipient, or in some cases there are multiple designated recipients. And they have to agree on how the funds are going to be distributed within that urbanized area among the various transit operators, if there are some, different parts of the service area, and how the funds are going to be spent for which capital projects. The planning process determines how the funds are going to be used. And for those cities over 200,000, with a very few exceptions where there were some grandfathering provisions as areas grew over 200,000 and Congress wrote in some special exceptions, but for the most part, areas over 200,000 cannot use the money for operating expenses. They can only use it for planning and for capital expenses. And capital is defined pretty liberally to include preventive maintenance of the assets that they already have. So that's something that would, in most cases, be considered an operating expense, but there's a special exemption in our law that treats preventive maintenance as a capital expense, so that they can capitalize some of their otherwise operating expenses, but they can't use any of the money to pay for fuel or for drivers' salaries, that kind of thing. Though there was a small exception in this year's Appropriations Act that, because of the downturn in the economy, that allowed $100 million nationwide to be used for the cost of fuel in these large urbanized areas or other urbanized areas too, and defined it as a capital expense for this one-time instance only. So we have to be alert every year as to any special provisions that might be in the Appropriations Act for that particular year, and that's the kind of information we provide in that Federal Register notice that we publish at the beginning of the federal year. We highlight any changes or exceptions that Congress may have enacted. For the cities under 200,000 in population, and the threshold is 50,000 because that's the small end of what census will define as an urbanized area. So for the small urbanized areas between 50 and 200,000 in population, the funding is not apportioned directly to the urbanized area, but there's a lump sum to the state. We call it the governor's apportionment. It's really at the state level. It's funding that can be used in any of those cities. And we do publish the amount in the Federal Register notice. We publish the amount attributable by population and density to each of those areas, but the governor or his designee, usually the State Department of Transportation, is free to move the money around or reduce or increase the amounts within the amount available. In the large urbanized areas, the formula includes some factors like how many buses they have and how many miles they went and how many passengers they had, and there are some incentive tiers that have productivity factors. But for the smaller urbanized areas, the formula is just entirely based on population and population density. And in these small areas, they can use the money for planning and capital purposes, but they can also use it for operating assistance. And I will take a little detour here and say that across our programs, the standard local share requirement, the federal matching requirement for capital and planning is usually 80-20, 80% federal money and 20% local money. For operating assistance, what's eligible is the net operating deficit after they subtract out any fare box revenue that they have. If they're eligible for 50% of the net operating deficit, so they have to come up with half of that deficit in local or state money and half in federal money. Okay, moving on. The Section 5309 program has three parts, and one of them is a discretionary program, bus and bus facilities, that I'll talk about later, but there are two. One part is formula, fixed Guideway modernization, and then the other part of 5309 is the new starts, small starts. But focusing on the formula program, fixed Guideway modernization, this is a very complicated 7-tier formula, but basically the funds are allocated to urbanized areas over 200,000 in population that have fixed Guideway segments that are more than 1 mile long and more than 7 years old. Well, as you know, FTA over the last 20 years or so has been investing in a lot of new start systems, and it began to be clear that while we were putting all this money into building new systems, after they got to be a certain age, you began to need to have an investment in maintaining them so that they didn't get out of state of good repair. And then we also had some very old systems like Boston and New York and Philadelphia, the historic rail cities that had really big capital investment needs to keep their systems in a state of good repair. So this program is not, it wasn't one of the original programs, but it was enacted, I think, back in the 80s to really recognize those old rail cities in the first several tiers of the formula, and then in the lower tiers of the formula, all of those new starts that we've been building over the last 20 years, as they began to have segments that were more than 7 years old, moved into this formula program to provide money for maintenance. And again, the fixed guideway mileage and some of the productivity factors of operations go into that formula too, and some of the lower tiers. And this is a capital-only program, so it's no operating expenses, not even, well, preventive maintenance and new capital and repairs for fixed guideway systems. Again, there's a variety of fixed guideway systems, but heavy rail, commuter rail, light rail, trolleys, even to some extent exclusive bus lanes, but these are systems that have a set guideway. Then the other urban program is the Section 5309 New Starts, Small Starts program. This is a discretionary program. It funds major capital investments in new fixed guideway projects or increases in fixed guideway, increases in capacity on an existing fixed guideway system at times. And then the Small Starts part of the program was new under Safety Lieu, and it's a smaller federal investment, and those projects tend to be more light rail or even bus rapid transit with an established guideway, if not quite as fixed to one as tracks that a rail car would run on. This is a discretionary program, and each year in the appropriations legislation, Congress, this is one of the few programs that is still earmarked in a sense for specific projects at specific funding levels. And there are really detailed requirements in the law that FTA rate and evaluate each project according to very specific criteria. We get involved fairly early in the planning process for these grants, and they have to meet certain thresholds to be even eligible for federal funding and determining the readiness of the projects to proceed. But and we do an annual report to Congress on which projects are ready to move forward. And once a project really has passed through certain stages of development, preliminary engineering and final design, we enter into what we call a full funding grant agreement for New Starts project, or a project development grant agreement in the case of the Small Starts projects, where we've defined the scope of the project, defined the limit of the federal investment in the project, and in the case of the New Starts, these really big projects that take many years to build and many years to fund because all of the funding isn't available in 1 year, we have a schedule of anticipated federal appropriations and payments up front before they enter into the project. And some of these have payout schedules that may extend for 8 or 10 years, and sometimes even after a few years after the project is actually entered into revenue service. The service has begun, people are riding the system, but they still may have another couple of years of getting their federal funding for the project. So these are really major capital investments at the federal level that get a great deal of scrutiny and political attention and are very important decisions at the local level for economic development and livability. Section 5339 was a new program in Safety Lieu, alternatives analysis. Alternatives analysis is one phase of the planning process for a New Starts project. It's very early in the game where you're actually saying, before you've set on a particular corridor or even a particular type of service, a mode of service, it's looking at all your options. It's even before all of the environmental analysis of the environmental impact statement for these major projects takes place, but it's an early part of that planning and decision-making process. And it used to be an eligible activity under the New Starts program. And starting with Safety Lou, the eligibility for this early part of the planning was removed from the 5309 New Starts program, and Congress established a new program, 5339, just for alternatives analysis. Again, initially, much of the funding was earmarked by Congress, and in the last few years since Congress abandoned earmarking, we've had a discretionary competitive process for selecting the recipients of this alternatives analysis assistance. And again, it's a fairly small amount of money, but very important to those systems that are considering entering into a development of a New Starts project, to get off on the right foot and to look at their options and to come up with the right options that are realistic at the local level and that are affordable both for the local government and for the Federal Transit Administration. So now looking at some of our smaller programs, Section 5308 was new in the T21 authorization. It started out as a formula program under T21, but they didn't ever appropriate the funds. It was one of those rare cases where they authorized the program and set the funding levels, but never actually provided the funding in the Appropriations Acts. So we had kind of a dormant formula program that never really got off the ground. But then in Safety Lou, they changed it to a discretionary program, and in the first few years they earmarked much of it, but again in the last year or two we've done a competitive selection for all of the 5308 Clean Fuels program. Again, it's only for urbanized areas that the Environmental Protection Agency has designated as non-attainment or maintenance areas, and the purpose is to promote the use of vehicles that use clean fuel technology, and the kinds of fuels are specified in the law, including there's a cap on how much of the money can be used for clean diesel projects, which since the initial inception of the program, the fuels have gotten better and better, more environmental, so diesel isn't as dirty a fuel as it once was, and the fuel that these clean fuel sources were replacing is actually about as clean as some of the alternative fuels at this point. But technology has progressed, but we still have a clean fuels program, and we'll see what happens to this program in reauthorization. I'm not taking any bets, but this could be one of the programs that gets merged into bus and bus facilities or into one of the other formula programs. Next, moving away from our urbanized areas, we have a program to support public transit in what we loosely call rural areas. It's really rural and small urban cities under 50,000 that don't meet the threshold to be an urbanized area when the census publishes the list of urbanized areas. And I'm going to spend a little bit longer on this program simply because this was my area of expertise within FTA. For a long time I was the manager for this program, and in fact when I was an intern back when I first came into the Department of Transportation in 1976, one of my first intern assignments was working on the demonstration program that preceded our rural transit program, and that was in the Federal Highways Administration. It was a demo program to see if you coordinated the human service transportation that was being provided in many of these small communities, an area agency on aging van, all these human service vans were running around with a few people on board, sometimes passing each other on the country roads, going to their own destinations. But the idea was, and this Section 147 demo program that was funded in an Appropriations Act back in the mid-70s, the idea was if you just coordinated some of this human service transportation and put in a little bit of additional seed money, you might have a core of service that could provide some kind of transit service, usually demand responsive for the general public, people that weren't necessarily agency clients but who still needed a ride in a rural area. Well, the program was successful, and we were still the Urban Mass Transportation Administration, but in 1979 we got the new Section 18 program, and it was $65 million a year, and it stayed at that funding level for over a decade until it has grown and grown and grown under the last few authorizations. Now it's over $500 million a year, and there's transit service in maybe 1,500 rural communities around the country, and it's ridership is growing still. In the early years of the program, Federal Highways had administered the demo program, and they had field staff in every state. That they had more staff resources than we did in UMTA at the time, and so we delegated administration of the program to Federal Highways from 1979 through fiscal year 1983. And then in fiscal year 1984, we took back the program and to administer ourselves, and we did it as consolidated grants to the states for a program of projects. But because it had that unique history of having been administered by Federal Highway Administration in the early years of the program, it acquired some anomalies in eligibility and in the way the program is administered that linger to this day. And so there are a lot of little exceptions in the program, that there are some things that are eligible that aren't eligible under other FTA programs. We look at a lot of things a little differently under this program. In ICE-T, back in 1991, I mentioned there were a lot of changes in ICE-T. One of the changes was that the Urban Mass Transportation Administration was changed to the Federal Transit Administration. And that was in large part, I think, to recognize the success and the growing importance of the rural transit program, and realizing that public transit wasn't just an urbanized area phenomenon. It wasn't just all about new starts, and it wasn't all about fixed route bus service in our major cities, that there were a lot of dial-a-ride vans out there providing really crucial service to people that lived in rural areas. And so the name of our agency changed to FTA back in 1991. Looking in a little more detail at the Non-Urbanized Area Formula Program, the funds are apportioned to the states based on non-urbanized land area and population. There's a small part of the formula that's based on density, where you reward low density. In the urbanized area formula, the formula rewards high density. In the non-urbanized area program, a portion of the money based on density rewards low density because it's more expensive to provide transit service where people live further apart and their destinations may be hundreds of miles away, not 2 miles away. So that's an interesting little feature of the rural program. And it's at the state level that the decisions are made how to distribute the money within the state. It's to cities under 50,000 in population and to areas that are even more rural than that. And the subrecipients under this program, the actual providers of the transit service at the local level, include not just public bodies, as in most of our programs, but private nonprofit agencies. And that's largely due to the history of the program that I mentioned. It really grew out of coordinated human service transportation. And often the area agency on aging or some particular service agency that's maybe transportation wasn't their primary mission and they just needed to operate some vans to get the people to their primary services, but they became the public transit provider for the community, and some of them now have kind of spun off into dedicated transit agencies, but they still have a private nonprofit agency status rather than being the city or the county. Some of them are cities or counties too. And again, in the rural program, the funds can be used for capital and or operating expenses. Ironically, not planning, though the state can use 15% of the apportionment for planning and administration of the program and oversight of these subrecipients. There are several set-asides under this program. One of them was new in ICE-T. In the late 1980s, the intercity bus industry had experienced deregulation. Up until the late 1980s, the federal government the Interstate Commerce Commission had control over who had what authority to operate where, and it was hard to withdraw an unprofitable route. There was economic regulation of the intercity bus industry, and that changed during the 1980s, and the industry was deregulated. And the industry took advantage of that opportunity then to eliminate unprofitable routes and to contract, and that really had an adverse impact on rural areas, and in many cases that was their only link to the outside world. So in 1991 in ICE-T, Congress enacted this requirement under the rural program that the states spend 15% of their annual apportionment to support rural intercity bus service. Again, this was an expansion of mission for the Federal Transit Administration. If you remember back on one of the early slides, I said in the definition of mass transit that intercity bus service was specifically excluded from what was eligible. And here we've got a mandate under this program to support rural intercity bus service. And so it was a challenge to some of the states to do this, but most of them have an active program now, and they have to fund 15% of their rural funding to support intercity bus service unless the governor certifies that the intercity bus needs of the state are adequately met. And Safety Lou beefed up that certification a little bit by saying that they could only certify after consultation with the intercity bus industry. And we in our program guidance said, and the affected communities. So they don't have to spend it all for intercity bus, but there's a strong incentive to do it and a requirement that they consult to see what the needs are. And then 2% of the 5311 program is taken off the top before it's apportioned to the states for the Rural Transit Assistance Program, which is basically a training, technical assistance, research, and support services to support rural transit. And it dates back to 1987. It was funded out of a number of different funding sources over the years until in Safety Lou it moved to a takedown from the rural program to give it a stable and reliable funding source. We distribute 85% of it by formula, same formula as for 5311 transit funds, to the states to use to provide training and technical assistance to their subrecipients. We set aside 15% for a national program of technical assistance to support rural transit. Again, I think back in the 1980s, rural transit was still a new concept, and they didn't have the sophistication of our urban transit system, so there was a need to kind of professionalize the industry that might have had vans driven by volunteer drivers or by social workers for these human service agencies, but the RTAP program was really used to train drivers and to train transit agency managers, and the state of the art of rural transit has really improved over 20 years. And then one more takedown before the funds are allocated to the states for the Tribal Transit Program. And it's to fund transit for federally recognized Indian tribes. We administer that as a discretionary program, which I'm going to move on to the supplemental discretionary programs. So we talked about the formula programs. We talked a little bit about some of the smaller discretionary programs that support basic transit service, but then there are some supplemental discretionary programs that support transit in both urbanized and rural areas. The biggest of these is the Section 5309 Bus and Bus Facilities Program. Eligible recipients are public bodies. Private nonprofits are eligible as subrecipients, and that was newly spelled out in Safety Lou, though it had always been a practice. And again, this is discretionary, capital-only funding for vehicles and bus-related facilities in both urbanized and rural areas. Historically, the program was highly earmarked for specific projects, not all of which were even transit projects or eligible recipients, but they were all, sometimes the earmarks were in law. But in the last few years, we've had several opportunities to do notices of funding availability, and we've identified specific policy priorities, and I've used these bus and bus facilities program funds to support the livability projects, for projects that had a focus on sustainability and livability at the community level. And we've used most of the money for the State of Good Repair initiative, focused on, again, on buses and bus facilities. And we've used a smaller amount in the last 2 years to support a special initiative for veterans and community living in cooperation with the VA and the Department of Labor and other federal agencies to support the needs, transportation needs of veterans and their families. Another specialized focus program, again, this one is not a discretionary program, this is a formula program, but the Section 5310 program is to provide services that meet the needs of the elderly and persons with disabilities. Again, it's a state-administered formula program. The states allocate the funds to subrecipients. Most of them are private nonprofit organizations. This program dates back to the mid-1970s, and initially it was only private nonprofit organizations. I think it was either ICE-T or T21 expanded eligibility to purchase of service to encourage agencies that might be better off buying service from either the local rural transit system or from a private taxi cab company rather than owning and maintaining their own vehicle. So purchase of service as an eligible capital expense is unique to this program. Again, this is a program where the funding was at about a $25 million a year level for a long time, but has increased in recent years. And it's a gap-filling program. It was intended to provide, from the origins, it was intended to provide specialized services for these two populations of individuals when public transit service was unavailable, inappropriate, or insufficient. Since the ADA was enacted in the early 1990s, there shouldn't be any public transit service that is totally inappropriate, because they should have to provide complimentary paratransit for individuals that can't use fixed route service, but it's still insufficient in many areas to meet the needs of these special populations. So this is a supplemental program, again, state administered for both rural and urbanized areas, but all of the funding goes through the states, and they give it primarily to private nonprofit agencies, though public agencies that are the coordination entities for human service transportation in an area are also eligible subrecipients. Then two programs that focus on other target populations. Section 5316 under Safety Lieu was initially enacted in T21 as a discretionary program. It became a formula program under Safety Lieu. Job access and reverse commute. Again, it was initially enacted to support welfare reform when the need for transportation both to jobs and to support services like child care and job counseling, employment services, and so forth was identified in the Department of Labor and other human service agencies as being one of the major problems to getting people off welfare and into gainful employment. And so it was targeted initially as part of that welfare reform initiative in the mid-1990s, but in Safety Lieu it became a formula program. And then it's based on low-income population, funding capital, operating, and planning expenses to meet these target needs. Funds are allocated to the states for small urbanized areas and for rural areas, and then directly to large urbanized areas. And again, like the 5307 program, they have to designate a designated recipient so that makes the funding decisions at the local level. The New Freedom program was part of a larger administration initiative that was intended, and it was new in Safety Lieu. It was intended to support individuals with disabilities with services that went beyond the minimum requirements of the ADA. So the ADA is a civil rights law, and it simply says that individuals with disabilities are entitled to the same access to the same services that people without disabilities have. But the New Freedom Initiative was really aimed at integrating individuals with disabilities more fully into the community and providing supplementary services that went beyond what the ADA actually required. Again, like JARC, it's a formula program, and it's administered to the urbanized areas and to states. There's a common planning requirement for both 5310, the program for the elderly and persons with disabilities, for the JARC program and the New Freedom program. All of the projects that the designated recipient selects must be derived from a locally developed, coordinated public transit human service transportation plan. So you need to get all the players at the local level around the table, the human service agencies, representatives of the stakeholder groups, to decide what are the gaps in service, where is transit not doing the job, and what special supplementary services do we need. And under these programs, some alternatives to public transit that don't actually fit the definition of public transit are eligible, some more targeted services that meet the needs of these population groups. Again, we've provided substantive guidance for all of our programs and program circulars, and I'm not going to get too deep into the details about what's eligible and what's not, but that's a broad brush overview. This is a new program in Safety Lou. It's Transit in the Parks, which was renamed shortly later the Paul S. Sarbanes Alternative Transportation in the Parks program. This is a discretionary program, and again, this one's unique as it includes not only public transportation, but some alternatives to public transportation, some non-vehicular transportation like boats or walkways and different kinds of things that support public transit use in the parks and get people out of their cars and into the facilities with minimum impact on the parks themselves, parks and public lands. And we work really closely with the federal land management agencies, especially the Department of the Interior, but also the U.S. Department of Agriculture, which administers the Forest Service and Bureau of Land Management. So we work in consultation with the Department of the Interior in the administration of this program. And then one more really focused program, again related to the ADA, the Over-the-Road Bus Accessibility Program, another discretionary program. And here's another anomaly from the typical FTA eligibility. The only eligible recipient under this program are private for-profit bus companies. And there's two kinds of them. Some of them are charter and tour operators. Again, you'll remember when I talked about the definition of transit, it specifically excluded charter and tour service. And in fact, our recipients are prohibited by law from providing any charter and tour service. But this program is targeted at helping these private for-profit entities meet the demands of the ADA, that they have lifts on all of their vehicles under certain timetables under the ADA, depending on how big an entity they are. So we provide funding almost exclusively for lifts on buses. We make a lot of $30,000 grants. We don't pay for the whole over-the-road coach. We just pay for the installation of the lift and the training of the drivers on the use of the lift. Again, it was enacted in T21, but it was continued in Safety Lou. But here's a case where it was in both T21 and in Safety Lou, which both were authorization occurred after that we were codified in Chapter 53 of the U.S. Code 49, but they didn't codify this program, which could be a signal that it's viewed as a temporary transitional program during the period when these entities had to come into compliance with the ADA requirements. And then I'm going to just really quickly run through a few other non-codified programs. I think most people are familiar by now with the Recovery Act, ARA, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act in 2009 that funded capital projects, shovel-ready projects to help the economic recovery during the current recession. TIGR was a special program, sub-program under ARA. FTA gave it the name, I've forgotten what all the letters stand for, but it's greenhouse gas reduction, energy efficiency. And it was enacted in ARA as a discretionary program. But then Congress liked it and funded it again in the Appropriations Act in 2011, but they didn't provide any money for it in 2012. So we'll see what happens to that one in the next authorization. TIGR was another ARA program, and again, DOT came up with the name, but the Congress came up with the eligibility and the principles in the Recovery Act for big multimodal investments in infrastructure, again, to support the economic recovery of the country. But it wasn't just transit, but transit projects were eligible, and we funded some. FTA is administering the transit projects that were funded under TIGR. And again, they funded it under the Recovery Act, but then in the Appropriations Acts in the 2011 and 2012, they provided additional funding for another round of competitive selections. Lower Manhattan Recovery was a special source of funding after the tragic events of 9/11 in New York City to help rebuild the transit infrastructure that was wiped out in the attacks on the World Trade Center. And WMATA, back in the 1960s and 70s, had special funding under the Stark-Harris. WMATA is the Washington, D.C. area transit operator. The subway and metro in the Washington, D.C. and surrounding Virginia and Maryland suburbs was funded under special appropriations called Stark-Harris back in the 60s and 70s, but now the system's 30 years old and is showing the wear and tear. And so for the last few years, Congress authorized, not under our authorization, but under a separate act, authorized $150 million a year that's targeted to restoring state of good repair in the rail system for the Washington Metropolitan Area Transportation Authority. I've just skimmed the surface today, and given a real whirlwind tour of the FTA grant programs. On the last slide, I have some resources that you can turn to if you're hungry for more information. The primary FTA website is at fta.dot.gov, and if you put in a /grants, you'll get straight to the page that talks about each of the grant programs and provides more details and links to the program guidance and links to the discretionary grant programs, notices of funding availability, and everything you want to know about the grants program you can find on that page. If you want to look at the law itself, you'll find it at 49 USC Chapter 53. Thomas is the Library of Congress website where during the reauthorization process or the annual appropriations process, you can go to the thomas.loc for libraryofcongress.gov and check on the status of any bill or sets of bills, or whether it's passed the House or the Senate, or if it's gone to conference, if you want the latest up-to-date status and links to the actual language of proposed legislation as well as enacted legislation. And finally, I've provided the general receptionist number for the Office of Program Management if you have a specific program question at the program level. If you have specific questions about your specific city, I would encourage you to contact your FTA regional office, and there's information about all the regional office contacts on the website at fta.dot.gov, and that'll get you straight to the person that's familiar with your area and familiar with the grant making within the agency. So I've talked long and fast, and I hope I've given you a comprehensive overview of the programs, and I encourage you to use these resources to find more information as you need it. Thank you for your attention today.